Hi, I'm going to be talking to you today about Pripyat, Ukraine, and the effects of the Chernobyl disaster of 1986. So here's a slide of our objectives. You can pause and see what we're going to talk about today. And here are the contents, same thing. So here are the timeline of events. Basically, on April 25th, 1986 at 1 a.m., a preparation for safety began. Then at about 11:10 p.m., after the more qualified nuclear power workers left, the less qualified nighttime workers were in, and they were given permission to do the test, and the shutdown was granted, which at 12:28 a.m. caused the power to plummet below stability and xenon buildup in the core. Therefore, at around between 1:23 a.m. and 1:28 a.m., there was a power surge, and then the first explosion happened, and then a second, the roof blew off, radiation spread everywhere, and fires occurred. Firefighters were arriving between the hours of 2:15 and 6:35 a.m. They were not told what was happening. Reactor 3 had shut down. All the fires were extinguished except for the one in the core, and then between 10 a.m. and 2 p.m., helicopters began to dump clay and boron in order to try to fix this mess because the radiation had spread everywhere at this point. And then around 2 p.m. was when Pripyat began to evacuate. This was April 27th. April 28th, Moscow TV announced the incident, and on April 29th, iodine tablets were given to infants and children to try and prevent radiation poisoning. It was May 1st that children were removed from Kiev completely, but the May Day festivities still occurred. And May 4th, 800,000 workers were involved with cleanup duties in order to fix this mess, and liquid nitrogen was pumped under the reactor to cool it. May 6th, emissions dropped, schools closed, stay inside orders were given, and it was May 8th that workers finished draining the water from the basement under the core. This is more specific to the area itself. 1970 was when Pripyat was created. It was supposed to be one of 8 atom towns where nuclear power plant employees would work, and it was 1986 that the power plant explosion happened. 26 was when a lot of people gathered on a bridge across the waterway to see this explosion. It was beautiful. There were colors everywhere, and so a lot of onlookers went over there to gawk at it in amazement. And the firefighters, as I already said, they arrived with no protective clothing. An emergency meeting was called, but nobody was alerted there was emergency when it was supposed to be given. And people, like the people in charge, completely ignored the fact that there was an explosion. They just couldn't believe it because I believe it was the February of this year that Gorbachev and the government was basically like, and accidents would never happen. They never happen in places like this. It's just not possible. Obviously it was. The buses arrived at midnight to begin the evacuations of Pripyat on April 27th, and residents were only given 2 hours to abandon everything except for what they really needed. They had to leave their pets behind. They did not know that they could never return back to their homes after this. They were told that eventually they could go back, but it became clear they never could. The embankment of the Pripyat River began on May 5th of that year, and the construction to prevent contamination, like further contamination from the water. And then 2013 was when the tourist trips had begun for people to come back to the area. This is a picture of a Pripyat back in its day. It was an incredible city. A lot of people they loved it. They had a great culture. There were cafes that people loved to hang out with. It was great. A picture of the explosion that happened. Here's a map of Chernobyl, the area that's abandoned. You can see right there. You can see the field camp. Here is where you can see the areas of contamination, the confiscated zone, the areas where things where people were affected, basically. You can see the red spot right there where it's the most. So here are the radiation rates in the environment between 2009 and now. As you can see, there is still quite a lot of radiation in this area. Most places don't reach above 0.3. That's more the norm. But here, like in some places, like the kindergarten's 0.8, but then you can see that the cooling towers with the 1.5 inside and 12.6 in the back, and just on the steps, like the concrete steps in front of Cafe Pripyat, 13.6 US fees per hour. That's insane, but that is what is still there right now. And people are allowed to tour. Between 1986 and 1999, it went up by a lot in 1998. That's a lot of young adults, which makes sense because of how young they were when this first happened. Children, you can see it went up, but then it went back down. This is probably because children may have had it much earlier because their bodies were so sensitive. So the reason it went down is not necessarily because they were able to survive it, but probably because a lot of them had actually passed away after these incidences. And the adolescence is still on the rise because of how young they were at the time of the incident. And I'm sure the cancer rates and like the discovery of cancer in their systems is still there. Here are the cases of thyroid cancer after the incidents of the Chernobyl happened. This is a result of, never mind. So these are of people who were in the area. 1991 and 1985, quite low, but then it was on the rise between 1986 and 1990. Then about 4 to 5 years after the incident between 1991 and 1995, you can see about like 175 cases were discovered out of the people who came from this area. It went down a little bit between 1996 and 1998, but you can see that this was like quite the peak of cases per 100,000 people that occurred between 1991 and 1995. Here is a map of the exposure to gamma radiation in thyroids of workers. 64% of people had 0.15 gamma radiation, which is quite low, but that's still significant compared to having none at all. And the highest at 1.5 to 3.0 is at about like 1%, 1.5%, but that's still problematic. You want to see all those numbers at zero. Here's a graph of all the contaminated countries that after the Chernobyl incident. It wasn't just in Pripyat. It affected a lot of places, obviously Russia the most, but it went all the way down to Moldova and Italy and Slovenia. All of these places were deeply affected by the Chernobyl incident. It caused radiation to go into the area. It caused contamination that wasn't there before, and it did affect people's lives, and people did have to stay at home, and they had to take precaution because of this. In summary, we know that any dose of radiation has negative effects. We know that nuclear power is supposed to be the safest way to have energy given, but we also know that any tragedy can be prevented. And if people took the palpable measures ahead of time to make sure that nobody got injured, this never would have happened. This was a huge betrayal of trust, and many hardships were faced because of it. Hopefully one day there'll be more adequate changing. And here's my works cited. Thank you.